How are you
So how
doing?
you doing today, Mel?
I'm good. I'm drinking this concoction that I made, which is pine and ginkgo biloba tea leaves. So, yeah, I am all right, actually.
A
It's really,
caffeinated beverage, is it?
no, it's just a local wild foods that I got from outside in a local woods.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. There was actually a ginkgo biloba tree, and people spend so much money. I've spent so much money in the past on, wild foods and supplements, and I just got it for free outside.
now that's using the old noggin. It's ginkgo biloba. That's what it's called.
Yeah,
I
ginkgo
see
biloba.
that on so many supplements I've had before. I see
Mm,
it. I think in a lot of
mm,
men's health supplements I've seen it in. And
mm.
like you, I've been guilty. I've spent so much money on supplements. My routine is fairly outrageous. I probably over a couple $100 a month I spend. But it's like everything I take, I feel like I need, and I can feel the difference when I don't take it. And
Mm.
my philosophy with the supplements now is it's like if I can have a certain level of feel good about myself, why would I ever want to choose to live less than that? Like once I know I can feel at this optimal level, like peak performance,
Mm.
why would I ever want to go back?
You got it. Exactly. Absolutely. And ginkgo biloba, by the way, it's a nootropic. So much like caffeine in my cup of tea here, being British, we were talking about nootropics though, weren't we? Things like phenibut and kiltep, which is something that I've tried in the past, which annoyingly, annoyingly reminds me of my borderline ex-boyfriend, because I remember I used to buy it when I had money and I was really excited, and it's expensive. Nootropics, the naturally sourced nootropics, so expensive. And you go into my room and just help himself to it. And I knew they
Oh,
did it because he'd opened the seal, and I confronted him about it. And he just like was still acting like it wasn't him, that it was me. And I'm like, oh my God, that's how you know when someone's maybe got a personality disorder.
what a great way to gaslight you in that situation. But I do love all of those nootropics. Like they say in a lot of teas, for example, there's theanine to help smooth
Mm,
out the caffeine. I like theanine. I think they consider GABA a nootropic. They consider Nopept, Phenibut, and there's a
mm,
bunch more. There's a bunch more that I forget, but they're so useful. Like I think they're like smart drugs is really what they're called, right? But
mm.
drugs themselves might be a misnomer too. It's more like natural supplements, really what they are.
Hmm. I mean, some are drugs though. So Ritalin, for example, is technically a nootropic, but I would not advise it for anyone. Not that I'm a physician, but I've always been into it because I'm a fan of adaptogens, and often they themselves are nootropics. That includes cacao powder, for example, medicinal mushrooms like chaga. Another thing, I went out and picked some of my own chaga mushrooms and turkey tail mushrooms. They just grow in the northeast of America, just like in the woods, and it's free food. It's free wild food, people.
Now you
Save
got to
so
be
much
careful with
money.
wild mushrooms to not pick the poisonous mushrooms, right? I think the ones that are like red and white, they're poisonous ones. But I'm not. I'm in no way an expert though. But I definitely like the getting closer to nature, being one with the actual
Mm,
plant-based stuff, natural
mm,
things. I think there's something to be said about that. I think a lot of people in America and all over the world, in the developed countries, a lot of us are missing out on that. We're living such in a sterile way through our devices, through in offices and etc. And I think we're missing out on a lot of that natural thing that say Native Americans here. They used to live that way. They'd be one with the world. They tried to use everything that they like anything they would kill to eat. They'd use every bit of it, so they were giving back. And I think we're just missing out on a lot of that stuff.
absolutely. And just the fact now things are just getting so much more expensive everywhere. For me, that's what's encouraged me to go out now and learn about foraging for wild foods, because a lot of stuff that grows naturally in our region, we can replace that. We can get vitamin C, for example, from rose hips that are growing outside, rather than spending lots of money on boxes of oranges not even like in season from another part of the world. Little things like that. Um, this is why I advocate for all my clients, and why I tell my YouTube viewers is the importance of just going outside in your day, because you need to activate your parasympathetic nervous system.
There you go.
Got it, PNS, got it. Yeah, we need to do this. We are in like a fight or flight response, just living in city lives full of chaos, full of stress, full of like Wi-Fi and all that.
Now, it's funny you mentioned the fight or flight response there. I'd gone to an anxiety seminar the other night. There was a doctor. She wasn't a psychiatrist, she was a psychologist. And she was talking all about the different kinds of anxiety there are. So, social anxiety versus panic disorder versus generalized anxiety disorder. And she basically said it was just like, it was an informative thing, but how the fight or flight response is what those people are stuck in, basically. And it's
Yeah.
really something that their body's trying to help them survive,
Mm-hmm.
but it's kind of like a maladaptive, I guess we'll call it, a maladaptive trait that they're doing to protect themselves, even though the stimulus that is forcing them to do that is not necessarily life and death like it used to be, like hundreds of thousands of years ago. But it made me think of this, because I've been hearing a lot about this with narcissism now, that people who had a parent or parents that were narcissistic, they are like a lot more likely to develop these anxiety disorders. And for me, I think that's been absolutely true. Because like I said, I think my father, covert narcissist, and there's something about that when you're in that environment where they're always being judgmental or emotionally abusive, that it's hard for that to go away, to like grow through that. And I think you had a similar circumstance with your dad, right?
Yeah. I briefly spoke about this with my audio call with Sam Backman. He's not been diagnosed. This is just what my whole family have been trying to like wrap their heads around, like what is wrong with him. Possibly what got me into studying psychology in the first place. Because on one hand, he's very clearly, he was on the autism spectrum, like Asperger's back then. Just the way he was very socially awkward, didn't know social cues, didn't really know how to talk to people. However, he was so grandiose and would, when he ran his business, just the way he talked to people and have that rage at times. And it ticked the boxes for narcissistic personality disorder. So I was just like, I don't know which is which. And I mean, despite that, though, I actually had quite a good relationship with him. But for me, I had quite a unique environment in that they were running a nursing home for people with mental health issues. So people with schizophrenia, for example, and then a mother, dealing with a lot of trauma herself from her family, quite possibly borderline traits. My father like that. So my level of what's considered normal and what's considered crazy is maybe a bit skewish, but whatever it was, it brought me. I was just fascinated with the human mind and, why people are different, why we do the things, why who we are.
I think it's so fascinating that people who have had similar upbringings often they turn out so similarly. And that was the thing that really, like, I was getting so many aha moments from listening to you and Sam, how he was talking about a lot of people who may have autism, like use narcissism as like their coping mechanism to deal with it. Because when they get rid of the narcissism, they're face to face with the autism. It's like it's very painful, and so they have this narcissistic buffer, right? So they don't have to feel that completely. It made me wonder. It's like, I wonder if my dad had a little part of that, or if I've even had a little part of that too. I'm not sure, but it was a fascinating concept that I've never heard before, and so that was really interesting.
It really is, because it made sense to me now after like years of training and studying and becoming wiser, that it's so obvious to me now that he developed like highly narcissistic traits as a coping mechanism. He was one of like 10 children. We know that his father was abusive, and if he's on the autism spectrum, then it would make sense that he would want to create this false grandiose self that he is amazing, that he is respected, everyone loves him, because he knows when he's interacting with people. Like, we go out for dinners and I'm kind of like the one who is being like the buffer and interacting for him and smoothing things out when he says the wrong thing. I can sense his like frustration in a sense. So he knows that it's there's nothing wrong with him, and so he latches onto this Alexander the Great kind of archetype. And and then like, but because thing is, I actually have sympathy for that, because I can see it's a cause and effect. It's very different to someone who has full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. Very different to like, I have met covert narcissists in the field of spirituality and new age and self-help, and they were a lot more malicious and different.
I want to flag that there too, because I definitely want to talk about the self-help people and narcissism, etc. as well. But like your dad, he was sounds so similar to my dad, because my dad was one of 8 or 9. I can't remember which, but he's one of 8 or 9. His father was very abusive to him. Both of his parents drank. think he'd even had fetal alcohol syndrome too.
Oh.
And like, I get what you said. It's like when you understand where they're coming from and how narcissism is usually just a response to trauma that they've experienced. I've always been curious, like what makes people go to the narcissistic route from their trauma versus what makes people go to the borderline route from their trauma, because both of them are trauma responses. But to me, like the big difference is borderline people have the ability to be self-aware and they can self-reflect. And I always mention it's like that Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas scene where they take the ether, I think it is, and he goes like, the worst part about this drug is that you can see yourself acting in this terrible way. And that's exactly what borderline is. You have all like the fear of abandonment, the splitting, and you're really aware of what's happening, but it's like so difficult to stop it until you like recognize. But like, do you have any thoughts on that? Like the difference between what makes people turn to narcissism versus what makes people turn towards BPD or any other sort of trauma response?
Well, it's a mix of nature and nurture, isn't it? So, and that's what with BPD, for example, it's hard to distinguish because at the end of the day, with someone who is borderline, when you, as you said, with like they see themselves acting this way, when they get that self-realize, that awareness, there's a lot of shame that's evoked from that. And the sense of shame is what's stopping them from actually breaking through it, so to speak, and improving. It's a sense of shame that makes them want to run away, makes them want to distract themselves and jump into impulsive activities just to like rid themselves of the shame. Maybe it's going down a path of purity or wanting to get rid of it. Shame is at the core of trauma.
Right.
Shame and a sense of guilt, always. And I see this in everyone. People who have been abused by people with personality disorders, they're not necessarily having a disorder themselves, they're just traumatized. I can't particularly say like what makes someone go towards NPD, what makes someone go towards being borderline. Is this a mixture of like genetic factors, temperament, environment? End of the day, there's all trauma responses. What I will say is what Sam says quite clearly in his audio, that is really rare. NPD is extremely rare. That's not to say that it exists alone. I think it's on a spectrum and people be close to it, pathologically narcissistic. But the way it's spoken about now, quite in mainstream YouTube videos, it's like that. It's like a bad thing and like everyone's narcissistic nowadays, you know?
I mean, there is a big difference between NPD and the narcissistic traits. I do think in the social media era here, so narcissistic traits are indeed flourishing, but there's definitely a difference between that and NPD.
Yeah.
And I know, like in my romantic relationships, I got to be careful having too much understanding of narcissism and like understand, like not having sympathy for it, but there's like understanding what's really going on. Like, oh, it's just trauma responses, because I can use that to kind of self-sabotage myself to like go back and say, you see, I can love that person. I understand that what they're really doing, they don't really mean it. They're just having a trauma response to something that's happened to them as a kid. And this is their maladaptive trait to adapt to it, right? Or their coping mechanism. But it's like, there has to be a line there somewhere between where are my boundaries? And even though I may understand what's going on here, what's still toxic? What's still like not right? And I try to see through everything through the lens like the radical self-respect thing now. It's like, if it's radically self-respecting myself, it's okay. But if it's not, then no matter what, no matter how much understanding of it I have, whether it's family member, friend, or romantic relationship, I probably still shouldn't allow it in my life. Like, there's going to be people who are less toxic, and we don't control who our family is, though, right? If it's going to be a family member, perhaps we can understand it, but to actually invite it in from the outside and like have more contact with it when we don't have to, I think that's where the line is. That's unnecessary.
I agreed. Like, part of my intrigue about personality disorders was inspired by family members. However, yeah, I agree with you as well in that it doesn't matter if someone is like NPD or like covert narcissist or just traumatized. If someone is treating you badly, just leave, just walk away. It's regardless, you don't have to be able to label them and diagnose them. Most of us, unless you're like a psychiatrist, I guess, you know, a doctor, you can't really diagnose them, can you? We it's great that these labels exist so that it helps us make sense of if we're dating someone who is just not other people. It just seems weird. There's something off about them. And we type it in and we think, oh, okay, that makes sense now. So to reach out to other people who've been through this. And this is the big thing with my clients is that number one thing is they feel lonely because like they think that no one else is going through this. So in a sense, labels are good for people to actually find each other. But then it's the attachment to the labels and then seeing it everywhere and becoming too hyper vigilant about everyone you meet, thinking, oh, they're dangerous for me because they're displaying narcissistic traits.
Right.
And this is why I did one of my videos, old models on Instagram, narcissistic. It's like, I didn't experience it as like NPD at all, but it was clear to me that they're traumatized. And so they're using social media to help make themselves feel better. And it's not actually helping them in the long run. It's, you know, it's shaky grounds they're doing this on. But I wouldn't say they're dangerous people. They're just people like you and I who are traumatized.
Right.
However, trauma acts differently. Everyone experiences trauma differently. So there are people who are actually quite dangerous to be around. And you have to trust your bodily instincts when someone's really not good for you.
I mean, that reminds me of what they did in the movie Joker, basically. Like, Joker was a person that had perhaps schizophrenia and had some trauma in his life. And it just presented in the way that he turned into like basically a serial killer murderer, right? And it's always fascinating me to recognize the difference between what makes someone crack in that direction versus what makes someone say, okay, I'm able to get through this and actually try to put my best foot forward. But it's an interesting phenomenon when that happens. But